Hello everyone. Let me give you an overview of British literature that will help you with various competitive exams. English literature is primarily the literature of Britain. But we also have English literature in America, European literatures in translation, post-colonial literatures in English from across the world, including India. So in this video, we will first talk about British literature. Britain is an island in the northwest of Europe. The original inhabitants of Britain were the Celts. They lived in the BCs from the 8th century to the 5th century BC, that is roughly the Iron Age. That is the time when Celts were found in England. They must have come from the continent, Europe, and they established their tribes in this island. And after the Celts came the Romans. The Celts were invaded by the Romans. That was at the beginning of the AD. And Roman period in Britain is a time of infrastructural development. There wasn't much literature at this time, but roads, buildings, etc. came into being at this time. England became more civilized. It was not called England at that time, it was called Britain. The Romans called Britain Britannia. The Romans left Britain in the beginning of the 5th century AD. That is because Rome, their country, was attacked by barbarians at this time. Barbarians are tribals who were enemies of the Roman Empire. The Romans in Britain left Britain, went to their own country, Rome. At this time, Rome is an empire. Western Roman Empire is there, Eastern Roman Empire. Two Roman empires were there. The Western Roman Empire was defeated by the barbarians. The Eastern Roman Empire continued to flourish. The Eastern Roman Empire is called the Byzantine Empire, and it fell only in the 15th century, the fall of Constantinople, it is called. Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire. Well, that is another story. Coming back to Britain. When the Romans left Britain, Britons were left alone. They didn't know what to do with themselves. They didn't know how to protect themselves. And they invited the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes to come and help them. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were mercenary tribes, like Gundas. They would take money and fight for other people. And they came to Britain. They settled down there. When was this? Do you remember? Beginning of 5th century AD. The Anglo-Saxons came and settled down in Britain, and by the 7th century, Anglo-Saxonization of Britain was complete. The Anglo-Saxon period is called the Old English period. The Old English period was the time when the Anglo-Saxons established their kingdoms. There were 7 kingdoms. They had their own literature, oral literature, their own history. Venerable Bede was an important historian. He wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English race. There were brilliant kings like King Alfred. The Anglo-Saxon period ended with the Norman conquest of 1066. There was a Battle of Hastings in which William the Conqueror conquered the English kings and became English king and became the emperor, the conqueror. That is the beginning of the Middle English period. So we have Old English period followed by Middle English period. Middle English period began in the 11th century, 1066. At this time, the church became prominent. Catholicism is spreading. People are Christianized. There is a Celtic version of Christianity. The Celts are still there in Britain, of course. The Celts are still there in Britain. And a Celtic version of Christianity emerged. And the church became predominant. The church preserved knowledge. There were monasteries where books were copied and preserved, but learning or education was not a democratic process. Everybody did not get education. Only the upper classes, only the high clergy. In the late medieval period, the church became corrupt. The high clergy became corrupt. And people wanted to reform the Catholic Church. This led eventually to what is called Reformation. Now, literature was there in the Old English period as well as Middle English period. But it is in the 14th to 16th centuries with what is called Renaissance that modern learning started, modern literature started. The father of Old English literature was Caedmon, and the greatest and oldest of the epics of the Old English period was Beowulf. In the Middle English period, there were two major genres: dream allegories and chivalric romances. In the medieval period, towards the end that is, there were brilliant writers in Europe: Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio. They were the people who spearheaded or began or initiated Renaissance. And at this time, in England, in the late medieval period, there were writers like Geoffrey Chaucer. As you might know, Geoffrey Chaucer is the father of modern English literature. Chaucer lived at a very traumatic period. In Chaucer's time, there was the Great Plague or the Black Death. It led to big changes in England, like the Peasants' Revolt, the changing of the serfdom to wage system. And Chaucer depicted all classes of people. He showed the entire 14th century society in his Canterbury Tales, as you might know. And he used a very realistic, humorous narrative style, very modern narrative style. After Chaucer's period in the 15th century, there was a big political upheaval in the Wars of the Roses, which ended with the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. It is in the Tudor period that Renaissance dawned. Renaissance is rebirth of the human spirit. In the medieval period, the human beings were considered to be sinners. The ordinary low-class peasantry were not given any right to learn or to have luxury, to have even decent living conditions. They did not have any right. it changed in the Renaissance period. Living conditions improved. In the Renaissance period, there was a spread of learning, especially classical scholarship. And literature began. Writing in the vernacular, English began. And the greatest period in English literature, the golden age of English literature dawned. The Elizabethan period. The period of the university wits, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Francis Bacon. Queen Elizabeth was actually the last of the Tudors. After the period of Queen Elizabeth in the 17th century, there was the Jacobean period. The period of James I, the first of the Stuarts. Stuarts are a dynasty, like the Tudors. Elizabethan period saw great lyricism. Elizabethan period saw popularity of revenge tragedies. They were there in the Jacobean period as well. It was a time of great writing and learning. There was a decline in the Jacobean period. In the Jacobean period, colonization of the New World or America had started. Colonization of Eastern countries also began. East India Company was established. Before that, there was the defeat of the Spanish Armada. England was slowly becoming a colonial power, an imperial power. There were absolutely great writers at this time, like Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, the university wits, Lilly, Peel, Lodge, Green, Nash, Marlowe. 7 of them were there. William Shakespeare, who wrote 37 plays. Originally we believed in 37 plays. Now 1 or 2 more have been added. He also wrote 154 sonnets and 2 long poems. Ben Jonson, who wrote comedies of humors. Francis Bacon, who wrote essays and philosophical works. John Donne, who inspired the metaphysical poets later. All brilliant writers. The Elizabethan age is glorified in the epic of the time, Fairy Queen. And the Jacobean writers could not match the brilliance of the Elizabethan writers. There was a decline. After the Jacobean period, there is the Caroline period, the period of Charles I, which is the time in which the Civil War began. The British Civil War between the Puritans or the Roundheads and the Cavaliers or the Royalists. Charles I was beheaded, regicide. And in the Civil War, the Puritan Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector. During this time, there are the post-Shakespearean dramatists. Chapman, Marston, Dekker, Middleton, Webster, Bowman and Fletcher. This is the time of tragicomedy, city comedies, masks. And the Civil War period is the time of the great writer John Milton. John Milton at this time wrote in both Latin and English. Primarily poetry, but he also wrote prose. He believed that he is the future poet, and he reserved prose to his left hand. Milton's left hand is his prose. After the Puritan interregnum, interregnum means in between rule. Oliver Cromwell's rule is called Puritan interregnum. After that period came the restoration of monarchy in 1660. The restoration of monarchy in the hands of Charles II brought back drama, There was no drama in the period of the Puritans. In the Restoration period, once again, there is drama. And Milton at this time wrote his greatest works: Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistus. At this time, that is the 17th century, in Europe, there is the philosophical movement called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment gave importance to reason, to science, and to progress. During the Enlightenment period, there were great philosophers in Germany and France who laid the foundations of modern philosophy and literary theory. In Germany, there were writers like Immanuel Kant, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. In France, there were people like Voltaire and Rousseau. The Enlightenment went hand in hand with Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism began with Dryden in the Restoration period. In the Restoration period, the most important writer was John Dryden. He revived classical principles. In his hands, modern prose was born. He was also a satirist. It was Dr. Johnson who called Dryden the father of English criticism. And his greatest satires were political in nature, because he was a Tory or a conservative politician. Dryden started his career by writing poetry. The first major poem that he wrote was Heroic Stanzas on the Death of Oliver Cromwell. His greatest satires came in the 1680s, 20 years after the Restoration. There were Absalom and Achitophel, The Medal, and Macflecknoe. He wrote these satires against his enemies, Earl of Shaftesbury, Thomas Shadwell, etc. Dryden's greatest critical essays were Of Dramatic Poesy and Preface to the Fables, which was written at the end of his career. In the year he died, it was published. Dryden also wrote heroic plays. Neoclassicism flourished in the hands of Dryden, as well as later Alexander Pope, Dr. Johnson. Before we come to that, I have to tell you about another important genre in the Restoration period, that is Restoration comedy. Restoration comedy was licentious drama, luxurious drama that flourished in the age of Charles II. William Wycherley, William Congreve, George Etheridge, etc. were important figures. And Restoration comedy was so licentious that it eventually ended and gave rise to very chaste middle-class comedies and tragedies called sentimental drama. And now about the major neoclassical writers. They were also called the Augustan writers. The Augustan age is the age of Alexander Pope and Dr. Johnson. Alexander Pope started his career by writing pastorals. Then he went on to write Essay on Criticism. This was in the early 1700s. Pastorals is 1709. Essay on Criticism is 1711. Then he went on to write brilliant satires. You might have heard of them. The Rape of the Lock. Then after that, Essay on Man, moral essays, the Dunciad. Pope was a man of physical ailments or diseases. And he was a very caustic satirist. And he held over English writers 1 century of influence. For 1 century, Pope was the greatest influence on writers. Pope lived at the same time as Jonathan Swift, another major satirist, but he was a prose satirist. During the Augustan period, there were also novelists. The development of the modern novel happened during this time. How did the novel develop? The novel developed in the periodical essays. The periodicals came into being at this time, starting from the Tatler. The periodicals had periodical essays. Read together, the periodical essays were like novels. You might have heard of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. Very major periodical essays associated with the Tatler and the Spectator. The greatest novelists of this time were Richardson, Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, Tobias Smollett, and Lawrence Sterne. The novel in the 18th century employed the technique of realism. However, some novels like Tristram Shandy are anti-realistic, making fun of the 18th century realist novel. The 18th century writers also made use of 2 other conventions, the epistolary convention and the picaresque convention. Samuel Richardson, for example, wrote epistolary novels in the form of letters. Pamela, Clarissa, Sir Charles Grandison. And the picaresque convention was used by Daniel Defoe in Moll Flanders, Roxana, and also by Tobias Smollett and Henry Fielding. Fielding's Joseph Andrews and Tom Jones. Tobias Smollett's Roderick Random, Peregrine Pickle, Humphrey Clinker are all examples. As you know, Jonathan Swift at this time wrote Gulliver's Travels. Well, Gulliver's Travels is not exactly a novel, it is a romance. In England and America at this time, there emerged 2 genres, the romance as well as the novel. The romance is bigger than a novel, usually, deeper, more psychological or philosophical. In the 19th century, novels like Scarlet Letter or Moby Dick, written in America, by Hawthorne and Melville, respectively, are examples of romance. Coming back to England, Dr. Johnson was an important satirist as well. He wrote London and Vanity of Human Wishes, 2 poems that are satires, Juvenalian satires. Dr. Johnson also wrote essays. He was a major prose writer. He made a dictionary in 1755. He wrote a very famous critical essay, Preface to Shakespeare. He wrote biographies of 52 poets, collected as the book Lives of the Poets. He was a great leader. He was the leader of Johnson's Circle, a group of writers and thinkers and scholars of the time. Dr. Johnson lived at a time when Romanticism was slowly making its appearance. Well, Dr. Johnson was a classicist, neoclassicist. But in Dr. Johnson's time, there was also the Romantic Revival. The Romantic Revival means revival of romantic elements from the medieval period. The romantic revival happened in the transitional poets, including the graveyard poets, as well as in the Gothic novelists like Horace Walpole. The transitional poets include James Thomson, William Blake, Robert Burns, and the graveyard poets Thomas Gray, Robert Blair, Thomas Farnell. The transitional poets and the Gothic romancers brought into English literature romantic values, nature, supernaturalism, emotion bordering on hysteria, and spontaneity of writing. Spontaneous writing, as Wordsworth said, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that result from emotions recollected in tranquility. The Romantic period dawned in 1798 with the publication of lyrical ballads, as you know, by Wordsworth and Coleridge, a group of 23 poems. 9 years before that, there was the French Revolution, which was a very great influence on Romanticism. Two revolutions, American Revolution of the 1770s and French Revolution of 1789, both influenced Romanticism. Romanticism was a period of revolution, nationalism. They upheld freedom of the individual, liberty, equality, fraternity. As you know, those are the slogans of that is the slogan of the French Revolution. So we have the high romantics, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey. They are also called the lake poets. And we have the late romantics, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. They were contemporary to Walter Scott. Novelists like Jane Austen, prose writers like Charles Lamb, Thomas De Quincey, William Hazlitt, Leigh Hunt. So many writers writing about subjective experiences, emotions, writing about nature, sometimes supernaturalism. This is also the time of landscape art, landscape paintings. We have John Constable, J.M.W. Turner. Very important figures. The early romantics, who were inspired by the French Revolution, later turned conservative. Wordsworth and Southey especially were criticized and attacked by the later romantics. In 1837 came the reign of Queen Victoria. This is the high point of industrialization in Britain. Britain led Europe in industrialization, starting from the textile industry at Manchester. Many industries developed in Britain, and there was rampant industrialization leading to the destruction of the countrysides. It peaked in the time of Queen Victoria, and there was a great exhibition of London in 1851. Of course, the Romantics reacted against it. And in 1859, there was another upheaval, the publication of Origin of Species. 1859, the publication of Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which overturned the biblical traditions of Christianity. It looked like the Bible is not literally true. because man has developed from apes. It was a very big shock to the Western world. The Westerners did not know what to believe in, religion or science. Which is better? The rural cultures or urbanity? They did not know. This led to Victorian dilemma. Before the Industrial Revolution peaked in the Great Exhibition of London, before Origin of Species was published, there emerged a group of poets called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, founded in 1848, their group. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood went back to medieval poetry and painting against the tradition of high Renaissance. At this time, the evils of the Industrial Revolution were showcased in the novels of Elizabeth Gaskell, Charles Dickens. Bourgeois materialism was criticized by writers like William Makepeace Thackeray, and the romantic passions were for the first time seen in the novels of the Bronte sisters. A new conception of womanhood emerged in the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, George Meredith, etc., Thomas Hardy. The great poets of this time, the Victorian period, were Lord Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, and Matthew Arnold. They showcased the Victorian dilemma in different ways. And the Victorian period gave way to decadence, symbolism, very confusing, unrealistic, anti-realistic, experimental movements. Also the avant-garde movements. At this time, the influence of France was great on English writers. French symbolism and French realism influenced British writers at this time. And new ways of expression, new ways of writing emerged. We have the avant-garde writers, the aesthetic movement of Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde. Art for art's sake, they believed in. Art does not have any relation or responsibility to the society. The avant-garde movements were experimental movements that showed absolutely new forms of expression, new colors, new forms, anti-realistic plots. We have brilliant writers like W.B. Yeats, G.M. Hopkins, George Bernard Shaw emerging at this time. Irish writers like W.B. Yeats, George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, J.M. Synge, Sean O'Casey, very prominent at this time. And the early 20th century dawned with the period of the King, Edward VII, Edwardian period, which was predominantly the time of realistic novel. The Edwardian period is the time of novelists like Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells, John Galsworthy, Arnold Bennett, E.M. Foster, Joseph Conrad. They were all early modernists who wrote about colonialism, class, moral dilemmas of characters. And right after the Edwardian period, there is the period of George V, which is the period in which the First World War happened, 1914 to 1918. Trench fighting, mass graves, tremendous destruction, leading to the European countries turning into wastelands. The traumas of the early 20th century led to modernism. The avant-garde movements were all modernist in many ways. The avant-garde movements include Impressionism, Cubism, Expressionism, Dadaism, Futurism, Surrealism. And they showed reality as changing, as treacherous. Realism is treacherous. Realism is cheating us into thinking that everything is good and perfect. Nothing is perfect. Everything is fragmented. Human beings have no value. You can't believe in time or history. It's betraying you. Such ideas are conveyed in the avant-garde movements, in modernist movements. And we have the great modernists, the high modernists writing at this time. Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce. They wrote about a fragmented world, confused people, dehumanized protagonists, decentered, like Tiresias in The Wasteland. Characters torn apart by their own desires and problems and experiences, always at loggerheads with the society, like the characters of D.H. Lawrence. They employed a stream of consciousness, free verse, fragmented narratives. There were so many traumas in this time. In the 1930s, there was a Great Depression, the Spanish Civil War. Late modernists, like the Auden group poets, also responded to all this. And then, at the beginning of the 30s, started the Second World War, the most disastrous of all wars until then. The Second World War led to a post-war generation of writers, like William Golding, like George Orwell, like the movement poets and angry young man movement. All of them responded to the traumas of the post-war world in different ways, depicted evil, wrote in a sardonic, cynical manner, wrote about the absurdity of the human condition, especially Samuel Beckett and the theatre of the absurd. So much violence and evil that characterized society at this time crept into the novels. Lord of the Flies by William Golding, A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, 1984, An Animal Farm by George Orwell, to name a few. After this, you can see the emergence of postmodern writers, a lot of women writers, diasporic writers, Muriel Spark, Iris Murdoch, Doris Lessing, some of the major women writers, Angela Carter. Muriel Spark wrote The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. I'm just naming the most important works. Iris Murdoch wrote Under the Net and The Bell. Doris Lessing wrote The Golden Notebook. Angela Carter wrote Black Venus and Other Stories, Nights at the Circus, The Magic Toy Shop. Then there is John Fowles, who wrote French Lieutenant's Woman. A.S. Byatt, who wrote Possession. Margaret Drabble, who wrote The Millstone, Jerusalem the Golden, The Peppered Moth, The Witch of Exmoor. So many major novels. Some of them won Booker Prize. All of them are bestsellers. Julian Barnes, Ian McEwan, Hilary Mantel. You know, Hilary Mantel won Booker Prize not once but twice. These brilliant writers are contemporary to the diasporic writers. So many writers from across the world have emigrated into the UK at this time. From Asia, from Africa. Starting from Sam Selvin, who wrote The Lonely Londoners. Salman Rushdie, who wrote Midnight's Children, The Moor's Last Sigh, Shame, Satanic Verses. Timothy Moore, Hanif Qureshi, Carol Phillips. They're all very prominent diasporic writers. And then there is Monica Ali, the Bangladeshi British writer, author of Brick Lane, Zadie Smith. So many writers writing at this time in Britain. British literature is no longer the literature of the whites in Britain. It incorporates a plethora of diverse experiences and narratives. And British literature is not only literature now, it is also web series, movies, the influx of the digital media, the cybernetic revolution has transformed literature of Britain like all other literatures have been transformed across the world. So that is a brief overview of British literature. If you take down all these names and read extra about all these writers and works, you will be a scholar in British literature very soon. Read these novels, get a taste of their writing, read poetry, read drama. There are so many writers I have not mentioned. For example, the dramatists. Dramatists like Edward Bond or Tom Stoppard, Carol Churchill, Peter Shaffer. There are also poets. I mentioned up to the movement poets. There are also poets like Ted Hughes, Andrew Motion. There is the contemporary poet laureate Simon Armitage. Carol Ann Duffy, who was the poet laureate before him. So many brilliant writers. So I hope you will read them, read about them, and make your own notes, do your own research. Wish you all the best.